Welcome to my channel. I am Ben. Today, we step into a chilling family tragedy in Georgia, a teenage girl's life on TikTok intertwined with the shocking discovery of her mother and stepfather found dead in their bed in a house where silence told two different stories. The house on the edge of Carrollton was still February, air hanging cold, the kind that clings to breath and lingers in curtains. Sometime in the darkness, while the neighborhood slept, two people inside that bedroom stopped breathing. No shouts, no broken glass echoing down the hall, just a silence so heavy it felt staged. By morning, the small routines faltered, a light left on, a door not fully latched, a room that felt ice cold. In one telling, a child would be the first to sense that something was wrong. In another, phone calls and whispers would ripple before anyone dared to say the word. Death. James Brock and Kristen Brock lay in their bed. The covers gathered like the ocean after a storm. The scene was simple, too simple. Pillows disturbed. A back door some would later describe as open. Investigators would call it a house with no signs of forced entry. Others swore a lock looked twisted, a mark like a pry. Two versions of the same night, standing side by side, refusing to merge. Outside, sirens cut across the morning like a blade. Inside, evidence waited in the ordinary. Fibers, residue, trajectory, time. And beyond the tape, a digital wake videos, tributes, a teenage girl speaking softly into a camera about loss and love and the unbearable weight of absence. The internet noticed. It always does. Weeks turned into months. Grief hardened into questions. A phrase began to circulate, a mountain of evidence. But the mountain stayed shrouded. Rumors said internet searches. Others said a glove in a closet. Counter stories pushed back negative tests, no clear prints, memories of a door and a draft. The case gathered heat without shedding light. Two lives gone. A family split by suspicion and defense. A community caught between prayer and accusation. In the hush after the sirens, one question pressed against the walls of that house and would not move. If the timeline is this quiet, where exactly does the truth make its first sound? But everything that comes next, the statements, the forensics, the digital crumbs, will test every assumption about that night. Carroll County, Georgia, is a landscape of contrasts, rolling farmland beside growing suburbs, churches with their doors open on Sundays, and families carrying the weight of complicated pasts. The Brock household seemed like any other at first glance, a blended family trying to stitch together new rhythms after old fractures. Behind closed doors, though, the seams were fragile. James Brock, in his early 40s, carried a history that could not be erased by Sunday prayers. Court records reveal prior arrests tied to drugs, probation, and a turbulent chapter that included a protective order filed against his wife, later withdrawn. He had moments of collapse and moments of recovery. By 2022, relatives said he had turned his life around, describing him as a born-again Christian, working to support his family, trying to shed a past that weighed like an anchor. Kristen Brock, Sarah's mother, was no stranger to chaos herself. Also in her 40s, her history showed arrests linked to possession, and even charges tied to cruelty to children, charges that still lingered unresolved at the time of her death. But family members insisted she was changing, that faith had reshaped her, that she and James were building stability after years of storms. In the eyes of her daughter, though, the picture may not have been so steady. Kristen and James were said to permit marijuana use inside their home, even with Sarah present, blurring lines between parenting and permissiveness. And then there was Sarah Grace Patrick, 17 years old. To the world, she was a TikTok teen, posting videos, sometimes lighthearted, sometimes heavy with the ache of adolescence. To her family, she was more complicated. Expelled once, then transferred to an alternative school. She carried the mark of a troubled student, but also a girl who managed to graduate early. who showed flashes of resilience. Those closest to her described her as sensitive, sometimes lost, struggling to find ground between rebellion and need for acceptance. Her grandfather stood firmly in her corner, calling her misunderstood, insisting she had no violent heart. But whispers grew, searches on her phone about how to kill, questions about her temper, about the weight of her relationship with her mother and stepfather. A 5-year-old half-sister lived in that same house, an innocent presence in a family already divided. The relationships in this story form a triangle of tension. Parents with criminal shadows trying to start anew, a teenager navigating identity in a fractured home, and a wider family split between defense and suspicion. Was Sarah trapped in a cycle she did not create, a product of unstable guardianship and unspoken traumas? Or was there a darker impulse taking shape beneath the surface of her online persona? One truth remains. Beneath the smiling posts and the Sunday sermons, there were fractures that could widen with one wrong night. And when the calm finally shattered, no one would agree on what those cracks had been warning all along. February 20th began like any other winter night. In Carrollton, cold air seeping into the cracks of old houses, frost lingering on the ground outside. Inside the Brock residence, a blended family was winding down. The 5-year-old half-sister had been put to bed, cartoons switched off, a nightlight glowing faintly in her room. Somewhere in the house, Sarah Gray scrolled through her phone, the glow of TikTok flickering against her face. And behind the closed bedroom door, James and Kristen Brock settled beneath their covers. Sometime in the early hours, the silence was ruptured. 2 shots, maybe more close range, sharp enough to shatter the stillness but muffled by walls and blankets. The bullets found James and Kristen where they slept. No chance to react, no time to rise. Death was instantaneous, investigators later said. What followed is the void that investigators still debate. Sarah's version, as told through fragments, was confusion waking to gunfire, stepping into a room that felt ice cold, noticing a back door ajar. She told officers she saw the lock broken, the porch outside open to the February chill. Detectives would later insist there was no sign of forced entry. 2 narratives stood in conflict from the very beginning. The 5-year-old child, too young to grasp the magnitude of the scene, allegedly walked into the bedroom and saw what no child should ever see. Her cries carried through the house. In those minutes, phones lit up, first Sarah's call to her boyfriend, then calls outward to relatives, neighbors, eventually to law enforcement. When deputies arrived, the house was dim, the air heavy. James and Kristen lay side by side, sheets tangled, their bodies still. The weapon, believed to be a rifle, was not immediately recovered in the room. Instead, investigators scoured for residue, fibers, prints. The scene was strangely orderly. No overturned furniture, no ransacked drawers. Only the bodies spoke. Digital traces began surfacing almost instantly. In the days after, Sarah posted videos online, tributes to her mother, tributes to her stepfather. She encouraged creators to talk about the unsolved murders, as if amplifying the search for justice. For weeks, she carried herself as the grieving daughter, speaking of love and loss. To outsiders scrolling TikTok, it looked like tragedy had struck a teenager far too soon. But whispers started to take root. Law enforcement would not release their evidence, yet they hinted at a mountain. Rumors spread. Google searches about killing one's parents, an item found with possible gunshot residue, a glove hidden in a closet. None of it confirmed publicly, but enough to seed suspicion. For 4 months, the case sat unresolved. The family mourned, the church gathered in prayer, and Sarah, still active online, became both a victim's daughter and, slowly, a person of interest. Then, in July, came the arrest. She was taken into custody, charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and weapons violations. To some, it was justice delayed. To others, It was a desperate attempt to close a case without definitive proof. The crime itself remains deceptively simple. Two parents in bed, shot as they slept. Yet around that simplicity swirls complexity, an open door, conflicting statements, the possibility of outside involvement, the shadow of drugs in the household's past. Even the timeline is contested. If Sarah truly woke to gunfire, why the delay in calling authorities? If the door was broken, why did detectives insist otherwise? And why, after searching the home thoroughly, did it take months to decide on an arrest? The Brock murders began as an open wound in a quiet Georgia town. But with each retelling, the wound has widened into something harder to heal. A story where the lines between victim, suspect, and survivor blur into each other, leaving no one untouched. And as investigators closed the body bags and carried James and Kristen out into the February morning, one chilling reality lingered in the air. This was no burglary gone wrong, no random act of violence. This was deliberate, intimate, executed within the walls of a family home, which begs the question, when the danger comes from inside, who can truly be trusted? From the moment deputies sealed the Brock residence, the case shifted from a family tragedy into a criminal investigation. Detectives in Carroll County moved cautiously, combing through the evidence they had gathered that night. Yet for months, they offered the public little clarity, only repeating one phrase, a mountain of evidence, against 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick. What made up that mountain was left deliberately vague. Forensic teams began with the basics. Gunshot residue testing on Sarah's hands and clothing. Those initial tests, conducted the morning after the murders, came back negative. No conclusive particles, no clear match. Investigators also searched the house top to bottom, seizing items that might later be tested. Among them was a glove, discovered in Sarah's closet, which allegedly carried traces of gun residue. But critics asked, if that glove was damning, why wait 4 months to arrest her? Digital evidence soon entered the picture. Detectives hinted that Sarah had performed troubling searches, online queries about how to kill parents, how to commit murder, even specifics about firearms. Law enforcement claimed these searches pointed toward premeditation. Her defenders countered that teenagers often search bizarre or dark topics, and that without context, the queries proved little. Family testimony complicated matters further. Sarah's grandfather insisted that the house showed signs of forced entry, pointing to a broken lock on a back door. He even produced photographs, claiming investigators had failed to dust properly for prints. Police dismissed this, reiterating there was no forced entry, suggesting instead that the killer had come from inside. Meanwhile, whispers about James and Kristen's history resurfaced. Both had prior arrests tied to drugs, and Kristen still faced unresolved charges. Rumors suggested their past may have followed them into the present, raising the possibility of outside enemies. Law enforcement publicly denied that theory, stating Sarah was the only viable suspect. Still, for skeptics, the failure to explore alternative leads fueled suspicion that the case was being rushed. By July, prosecutors took action. Sarah was indicted on 8 charges: 2 counts of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault, and 2 counts of possessing a weapon during the commission of a felony. The malice murder charges were the most severe, alleging that Sarah acted with premeditated intent. At her bond hearing, the tension was palpable. Prosecutors painted Sarah as a danger, suggesting she might flee if released, or worse, attempt to influence witnesses, particularly her 5-year-old half-sister, who had allegedly found the bodies. Relatives of James and Kristen pleaded with the court to keep Sarah behind bars. On the other side, Sarah's grandfather and pastor defended her character, insisting the evidence was thin, circumstantial at best. The judge sided with caution, denying bond. Sarah was remanded to solitary confinement, a stark contrast to the social media persona that had once defined her. The teenager who had posted tributes to her slain parents was now accused of orchestrating their deaths. Yet even with the charges filed, mysteries remained. If the residue tests were negative, how strong could the case be? If law enforcement truly had a mountain of evidence, why not reveal more to reassure the community? And why had it taken 4 months to move from suspicion to arrest? Every answer seemed to splinter into more questions. And those questions would follow Sarah into the courtroom, where the weight of digital traces, physical fragments, and contested family narratives would collide. But once the trial began, the walls of silence would no longer hold, and the case that started with whispers inside a dark Georgia home would become a spectacle played out under the harsh lights of the court. When the courtroom doors opened, the quiet of Carroll County gave way to the echo of footsteps, murmurs, and the weight of an audience waiting for answers. The trial of 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick was not just about a double murder. It was about trust inside a family home, the reliability of digital evidence, and the blurred lines between grief and guilt. On one side sat the prosecution. Their strategy was straightforward but relentless. Sarah had motive, means, and opportunity. They pointed to the internet searches allegedly conducted on her phone phrases about killing parents, how to commit murder, and firearm use. They argued that these were not the idle curiosities of a teenager but breadcrumbs of intent. They emphasized the glove found in her closet with traces of gunshot residue. Even if initial residue tests on her hands had been negative, they argued, the glove linked her directly to the weapon. The prosecution reminded jurors of Sarah's behavior after the murders. She had posted tributes online, even encouraged TikTok creators to cover the case while it was still unsolved. To them, this was not mourning, it was manipulation, a performance crafted to disguise guilt beneath sympathy. And they drove the point home with their most chilling assertion. There was no forced entry, no unknown intruder, only Sarah inside the house with her mother and stepfather. On the other side, the defense built their case on doubt. They highlighted the absence of direct evidence, the negative gun residue tests on Sarah herself, the missing murder weapon at the scene. They questioned the timeline. Why had it taken 4 months to arrest her if the evidence was truly overwhelming? They challenged the credibility of the so-called mountain of proof, calling it a hill of assumptions. Sarah's grandfather took the stand, firm in his belief that investigators ignored key details. He spoke of the broken lock on the back door, a photograph showing what he believed to be pry marks. He suggested law enforcement had failed to dust for prints, failed to explore the possibility of another intruder. His testimony was emotional, but it underscored the defense's theme. This investigation was incomplete. Witnesses for the prosecution included family members of James and Kristen, who described Sarah as volatile, capable of sudden anger. They told the jury she was dangerous, too unpredictable to be free. Their grief was palpable, their voices breaking as they asked the court to see Sarah as the person responsible for ripping their family apart. The defense countered with character witnesses: Sarah's pastor, teachers from her alternative school, people who described her as troubled but not violent. They painted her as a teenager caught in a storm of unstable parenting, pressured by circumstances beyond her control. Every detail was contested. The prosecution framed Sarah as a calculating killer. The defense insisted she was a scapegoat, targeted because she was the easiest answer. The jury listened, silent, as both sides clashed over the meaning of every search term. Every fingerprint not found, every test that came back inconclusive. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with tension. Spectators leaned forward as each exhibit was introduced, as each witness gave testimony that seemed to sway the balance, then tilted back again. And as the trial unfolded, one reality grew clear. This was not a case of simple facts, but of interpretations, where truth was buried beneath layers of suspicion and silence. And when the arguments rested, when the evidence lay scattered like shards of glass, one question lingered in the courtroom. Would the jury see a murderer, or would they see a teenager caught in the wreckage of a broken home? The trial may have dealt in evidence, exhibits, and procedure, but beneath the surface, this case has always been about psychology, about the human mind under pressure, about family bonds twisted into fault lines. Understanding Sarah Grace Patrick requires peering not only into what she allegedly did, but also into the context of who she was and what she lived through. At 17, Sarah straddled a fragile threshold. Adolescence is already a storm of identity, rebellion, and yearning for acceptance. In Sarah's life, the turbulence was magnified. Expelled from school after a drug-related incident, she was sent to an alternative program where, paradoxically, she excelled and graduated early. This juxtaposition, troubled yet capable, suggests volatility, but also resilience. She was not a one-dimensional delinquent. She was a teenager caught between chaos and possibility. Her home life reflected the same contradictions. James and Kristen Brock were adults struggling with their own demons, past arrests, addiction, domestic disputes. For Sarah, the line between parent and peer blurred. Accounts suggest James and Kristen allowed her to smoke marijuana, an act that eroded authority and muddled boundaries. A child raised in such an environment learns that rules bend, that roles are unstable. Psychologists often note that in families where parents act more like companions than guardians, adolescents can either cling tightly or reject violently. Then there is the digital stage. Sarah was active on TikTok, comfortable sharing fragments of herself with strangers. After the murders, her tributes to her mother and stepfather struck some as heartfelt, others as contrived. But this duality may reveal more about the pressures of performing grief in the digital age. Teenagers often process trauma online. Whether genuine or strategic, Sarah's posts became part of the prosecution's narrative. From a psychological perspective, the accusations rest on intent. The prosecution framed her internet searches as premeditation, a glimpse into a mind rehearsing violence. Yet psychologists warn against overinterpreting adolescent curiosity. Teenagers explore extremes, sometimes out of anger, sometimes out of fascination, often without action. The leap from search history to murder is not automatic. Still, one cannot ignore the darker possibilities. If Sarah did commit the act, the method shooting her mother and stepfather as they slept reflects calculated detachment. No confrontation, no argument, just execution in silence. Such behavior might suggest suppressed rage, a buildup of resentment released in one controlled moment. It raises questions about unspoken conflicts, about whether she felt trapped, powerless, or betrayed. Legally, the weaknesses of the case are also psychological. Jurors must weigh circumstantial evidence against the absence of direct proof. They must decide if Sarah's behavior was mourning or manipulation. They must judge whether a teenager's troubled upbringing explains her actions or excuses them. In the end, this case illustrates a central paradox. Sarah could be either a misunderstood child shaped by unstable parenting, or a concealed predator whose calm exterior masked a violent break. Both narratives live in the same space, and psychology offers no simple verdict. What it does reveal is this: when a family fractures, when roles blur, and when the internet amplifies every emotion, the truth can become elusive. And sometimes, the mind at the center of it all remains the greatest mystery of the crime itself. But as the gavel prepares to fall, one chilling uncertainty lingers whether Sarah is guilty or innocent. The forces that shape this tragedy are bigger than one teenager, and their consequences will not end with a verdict. When the courtroom emptied and the cameras dimmed, the community of Carroll County was left grappling with more than just a legal outcome. Whether Sarah Grace Patrick was judged guilty or whether doubt lingered, the story had already reshaped the town's sense of trust. In the days that followed the hearings, Conversation spilled from church pews to diner counters. Parents spoke of fear if a daughter could be accused of killing her own mother and stepfather. What did that say about the hidden fractures in other families? Teenagers whispered in hallways about Sarah's TikTok posts, torn between sympathy and suspicion. The internet, relentless as ever, turned the case into a digital battleground. Hashtags demanded justice for James and Kristen. Others insisted Sarah was being framed, a victim of an incomplete investigation. National media seized the narrative. Law, crime covered every filing, every statement, turning Sarah into both a cautionary tale and a headline. For some, the indictment confirmed their darkest suspicions. For others, it raised more questions than answers. The phrase "mountain of evidence" became a point of cynicism. What mountain? And why had so little of it been revealed? The Brock family itself fractured beyond repair. Relatives of James stood firm in their belief that Sarah had committed the murders, their grief sharpening into anger. Kristen's father, Dennis, remained steadfast in defending his granddaughter, insisting the system had failed her, that investigators had overlooked signs pointing elsewhere. One family, divided by blood, now permanently split by accusation. Sarah remained in solitary confinement, her life paused in a limbo few could imagine. Letters from supporters trickled in, as did harsh condemnations from strangers who saw her face on the news. Her TikTok profile, once filled with fleeting dances and tributes, became a digital memorial and, to some, a grim piece of evidence. For Carrollton, the murders left scars that would not fade quickly. Schools began to hold discussions on mental health. Churches prayed for reconciliation. Yet beneath those gestures was a deeper unease. If a teenager could be at the center of such horror, what other dangers were simmering unnoticed in quiet neighborhoods? And as the community looked forward, one truth lingered. No matter the verdict, the Brock murders had become more than a case file. They were a mirror reflecting fractured families, the weight of digital lives, and the unsettling reality that even the safest walls can harbor unimaginable darkness. Because sometimes, the most haunting legacy of a crime is not the answer it provides, but the questions it leaves behind. The story of Sarah Grace Patrick and the deaths of James and Kristen Brock forces us to reflect deeply on family, trust, and the fragile line between adolescence and tragedy. A 17-year-old girl, once sharing everyday moments on TikTok like so many other teens, is now at the center of accusations that she killed her own mother and stepfather inside their Georgia home. It raises a haunting question. Do the images we see online really reveal the truth of what happens behind closed doors? The lesson here extends beyond this single case. It reminds us that cracks within a family often start small: silence during dinner, a lack of understanding, boundaries blurred. When ignored, those cracks can grow wider until the damage is irreversible. It's a reminder to check in with one another, to listen more closely, and to never assume that an online post tells the full story of someone's life. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Sarah was responsible for this crime? Or was she just a teenager caught in circumstances beyond her control? Share your perspective in the comments, I'll be reading them. If this case made you think, hit the like button to let me know. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so together we can keep exploring true crime stories that challenge how we see justice, family, and human nature.